Hi, I'm Isabella,
I'm Jordan.
And I'm Justin.
and we will be presenting on the 1886 Charleston earthquake. So I'll be giving an overview of the earthquake. So it occurred on August 31st, 1886 in Charleston, South Carolina, but the epicenter was predicted to be around Summerville, South Carolina. And in this area, there had been four shocks felt on the 28th and 29th, but no one was really concerned or prepared for what was about to come. So, shaking from the earthquake was felt from Maine to Florida and as far west as the Mississippi River. It covered an area of about 5 million square kilometers. It was at least a magnitude 7 on the Richter scale. It was the most powerful and destructive earthquake to have been recorded in the southeastern United States. Over 100 people died, and the main shock lasted about a minute. And so the death toll was higher than it probably would have been because the heat wave occurring during this time. So many more people were staying out late because they could only do work during the evening when the temperatures were cooler and much more bearable. So, thus, many more offices, churches, and theaters were occupied and at full capacity. So, it made it much harder for people to find safety and escape the shaking. It caused about $5.5 million worth of damage, which is equivalent to about $112 million today. And this was because a lot of fissures ruptured all along the coastal plain. The largest was about 600 meters long, and there were acres of land that were liquefied.
And so continuing on, the Charleston earthquake brought other kinds of effects besides like physical destruction to buildings and such. The earthquake also brought about a shift in terms of the existing social structure. The earthquake obviously did not like differentiate what's destroyed. So the walls that separated the rich and poor had fallen. After the earthquake, there was no formal system for federal or state aid. Um, and so, to try and help with that, a man by the name of Frank Dawson played a big role in creating a complex subjective system in giving support. But the poor people and Black were angry because it seemed like the system wasn't focusing on those who needed the aid the most. The upper class white people were angry because it seemed to help tradesmen rather than others. Overall, because of the earthquake, tensions rose between the rich and the poor and the white and Black communities. Dawson tried to be the voice of reason to quell an uprising white supremacy movement, but was murdered, and his murderer was acquitted. And so, as a result, old conflicts were reignited and moved the city toward an era of racial segregation for decades.
Here are some pictures of the damage that occurred because of this earthquake. We can see in the top right a picture of the main street that was completely destroyed. On the top left, you'll see a ton of encampments that were set up for people who had lost their homes or were struggling during the rebuilding process. And then in the bottom middle, you'll see a perfect example of liquefaction. Moving on, here is a map of the area. So this earthquake had very mysterious origins. This is because South Carolina does not lie on any active tectonic plate boundary. So trying to discover why this earthquake occurred was very difficult. It was concluded that it was because of deep hidden underground faults. So South Carolina is located in the middle of the North American plate, which is far from any active tectonic plate boundaries. So we only discovered the deep hidden faults after years later, like after years after the earthquake ended. Research indicated that the mysterious earthquake occurred on an ancient buried fault thought to be a remnant of the breakup of Pangaea during the Mesozoic period. And residents were taken completely off guard. There were a lot of Catholics during this time in Charleston, so it was thought that it was Judgment Day and God was coming to take them away. There was a lot of structural damage from faulty construction during its founding. And Charleston's founding is very important to why this earthquake was so destructive. So, Charleston was founded by the British in 1670, and before they had arrived to colonize the area, the land was almost entirely marsh and it was not very accurately filled in for farming and city construction. So, the city had many issues with structural imbalances all throughout its history because of this rough foundation. And on top of this, when the earthquake did hit the city, it had still been recovering from a recent hurricane. And the USGS used this disaster to try and advance the field of seismology. So, although large tremors do occur infrequently in the area, and many residents are unaware of South Carolina's shaky history, past historical accounts of earthquakes in the state can go back as far as 1698.
And then moving on, we are going to discuss the trigger and the scientific connections. So scientists have classified it as an intraplate earthquake. An intraplate earthquake is one that occurs within the interior of a tectonic plate. But before they could classify it, this earthquake was considered a mystery. Initially, it made no sense because, as mentioned before, South Carolina sits on the North American plate, far from active tectonic boundaries. Many years later, scientists uncovered concealed faults along the coastal plains of Virginia and the Carolinas, and it's believed that the faults had formed during the breakup of the supercontinent Pangaea. It was then discovered that it was caused by accumulated strain in the Earth's crust until the fault ruptured. And in detail, it was that there was movement at the junction of two intraplate faults, the north-northeast trending Woodstock Fault and the northwest trending Ashley River Fault that caused this earthquake to occur.
So, for the overall statistics and damage of this earthquake, there were 60 human casualties, and for structural damage, there was $5 to $6 million in damage, and or adjusted for inflation, that would be $156.51 million. And this damage was accumulated from 2,000 buildings in the city. And many buildings actually had to be torn down and rebuilt because they were too damaged to be repaired. And damage actually occurred as far away as Tybee Island, Georgia, which is 60 miles away from Charleston. And some structural damage was also noticed in central Alabama, central Ohio, eastern Kentucky, southern Virginia, and western West Virginia. And this earthquake caused multiple fires, and water lines and wells were destroyed in the process. And what have we learned from the Charleston earthquake? Builders learned to add bolts and masonry to previously unstable buildings. This would prevent instability and add support to existing structures so that previously unstable buildings did not need to be demolished and money did not need to be wasted. And the US Geological Survey, or USGS, used the earthquake as an opportunity to study geology and advance the new field of seismology, since not much studying had been done on the topic so far. And this work solidified the view that an earthquake entails the passage of waves of elastic compression through Earth's crust. It also effectively buried the competing shrinking Earth theory that held that a cooling and contracting Earth leads to earthquakes. Deployment of seismographs around the country jumped in the decade after the Charleston earthquake, as scientists and the general public began paying more attention to seismic activity and risk. So overall, earthquake awareness greatly increased, and many new techniques were added to previously unstable buildings so that not as much damage would be caused by earthquakes in the future.
Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and we hope you learned something fascinating.